Testing, testing. Worked the first time this morning. I like it. That's a good sign. All right, welcome everybody. We're coming in and making their way in. All right, so this morning, this is our last class on David. So I've really enjoyed studying David a little bit more in depth than I usually do as far as reading through and stuff like that. So David's kind of a funny character in the sense that he's kind of got two halves of his life, right? Yeah, the first half of his life and everything's going great and he's someone you can look up to, and then the second half of his life, at least in terms of reading the Bible, kind of seems to be a lot more negative stuff, right? You have Bathsheba. I mean, that filled up 2 weeks of our study with that whole incident, and then you have Joab murdering people and David not calling him to account, and the whole Absalom and maybe some of his flaws or failures as a father. So the second half of his life is kind of usually the last part you study, and it can kind of leave maybe a not as great view of David as we usually think of him. So today we're just going to kind of go back over David's life and really look at how should we remember David, right? It's kind of an overview. We'll look at some new stuff at the end of his life and really kind of take away one of the main things that I think David is known for, should be known for anyway. Who knows the name Alexander Graham Bell? Everyone, right? What did he do? Invented the telephone. Everyone knows that, right? How about the name Elisha Gray? Who knows that? Not very many people. Well, if you do know him, he is most famous for almost inventing the telephone. There's a couple, I looked them up, there's a couple different accounts of history. One is him and Alexander Graham Bell were they were both inventors, they were both working on the telephone at the same time, and Alexander Graham Bell beat Elisha Gray to the patent office by like a couple hours and got the patent for the telephone first. The other account is Alexander Graham Bell actually stole the idea for some of the parts, the liquid transmitters. I don't know what that is in a telephone, but apparently it's important. But he stole the idea from Elisha Gray and then patented it first. So either way, they end up going to court, and Elisha Gray tries to sue him or something, and Alexander Graham Bell wins the battle in court and is now known as the guy who invents the telephone. That's what Elisha Gray is best known as. However, he has a pretty successful career as an inventor. He had over 70 patents, which is 70 more than I have. He worked on, a lot of his career was spent improving the telegram. You know, the old wire telegram, right? And in doing so, he actually invented kind of the precursor to the fax machine. Those things that work so great for us today. But I don't remember how it worked exactly, but basically you could sign on one end, and then there would be a mechanical device that would sign on the other end through like the use of wires, kind of like a telegram. Anyway, so, and his kind of biggest achievement was he founded the Western Electrical Manufacturing Company, which I hadn't heard of it, but apparently it's one of the Fortune 500 companies today, still going strong. And he was the founder of that. And he had all these great successes, all these amazing things that he did, and yet if you Google his name, not inventing the telephone is going to be the first thing that comes up, right? And I think we we do this kind of the same thing with David, don't we? He had all these great successes at the beginning of his life, and then at the end of his life, not so much, right? Kind of like when you are eating an apple, and it's great, and it's this nice, crisp, juicy apple, and you're eating through it, and the last couple bites are kind of mushy and sour, and just kind of leave a bad taste in your mouth, right? David can kind of have the same same effect on us. And I don't think that's fair. I think some people tend to view David as, oh, he kind of fell off his faith kind of fell away at the end of his life. Or he kind of fell off the bandwagon as far as, following God's laws and being faithful and all this kind of stuff. But I don't think that's fair or accurate. I think God does this with us, hopefully anyway, that he looks at our life as a whole. And I think we need to do the same with David. You look in David's life, even at kind of the bad times, things we view as bad times. Like I said, the things with Bathsheba, fleeing with Absalom, he was still faithful to God overall. With Bathsheba, he repented right away, right? There wasn't this blaming others, making excuses. He repented right away. He owned it. When he was fleeing from Absalom, he still prayed to God regularly. He even wrote a psalm. One of his most famous psalms that we looked at was during that time when he was fleeing from Absalom. So, how do we remember David? What is kind of his legacy, right? This is our last class. I thought it was kind of be appropriate to look at what kind of legacy did David leave for us. And I think if you look at his life as a whole, look at it through, I think it's a legacy of trusting in God, putting his trust completely in God. And this is something like you can see all the way through his life, all the way from when he was a shepherd boy, he fought off a lion and the bear, and that translates to fighting Goliath, right? He goes to fight Goliath, and what does he tell Saul? I fought the lion and the bear, God will look after me now, right? And then he goes on from there, and he's in service to Saul's military, and then Saul gets jealous and tries to kill him, and he spends years of his life running from Saul, living among the Philistines, out in the wilderness, all these things, and he has the opportunity to kill Saul, end all of his problems twice, which would have been very tempting, but instead he chooses to trust God, that God will take care of him and do the right thing and spare Saul's life. He's bringing the ark in Jerusalem. Doctor went over this. Bringing the ark in Jerusalem as it gets killed, and he stops the ark being brought in, but God sends a message to him, says continue bringing the ark in, and he has the faith, the trust in God that everything will work out right. He knows God's character, and even when you look at his dealings with Mephibosheth, right? We looked at that, Jonathan's son. We looked at kind of the worldly view of what he should have done according to the world with Saul's family, right? Wipe them out. But he shows kindness. I think that's a showing of trusting in God, that David is acting in good faith, that God's not going to turn this on him and make it a bad outcome for showing kindness to someone. And when he sinned with Bathsheba, right? The end of that, Nathan tells him, after he confronts him, God has taken your sin away, you're not going to die. And you see David act on that. He prays to God for the child's life and everything, but at the end of it, he cleans up, and he goes and worships God. He believes God. He takes God at his word that his sins are forgiven, and he goes back into the presence of God, kind of to resume the relationship, right? And in all of that, David you never see David pray for himself in that whole interaction with Nathan, and he's always praying for the child, knowing that God is a merciful God. Maybe he'll spare the child's life, who knows? But he never prays for himself, because I don't think he felt the need to pray for himself. God, please take my sin away. Nathan told him up front, God has taken your sin away. And I think David, his actions show that he took Nathan at his word, took God at his word, that his sins were forgiven at that point. And even when we talked about last week, this whole deal with Absalom, David had to flee Jerusalem. And when he fled, he started to bring the ark with him. The priest brought the ark out of the tabernacle. They were going to bring it with David. And once everyone's out of Jerusalem, David turns to the priest. He says, take the ark back into Jerusalem. And basically his attitude was, if I have found favor in God's sight, he will return me to Jerusalem. If not, then, oh well. And I will trust in him to do the right thing. So that's a pretty dark time in your life, to be chased out of your son is throwing a revolt against your kingdom, trying to take over, and yet you still have the attitude of, I will trust in God that he knows what he's doing and doing the right thing. And then at the very end of his life, we'll read this here in a second, in 2 Samuel 24, when David takes a census of the fighting men, right? This is kind of one of David's last acts as king as far as is recorded. And it's another mess up, right? It's another sin that he commits. And even through it, though, I think there's still some stuff that demonstrates his trust in God. So go ahead and go through that real quick. 2 Samuel 24, and we'll read verses 10 through 17. And this is after David takes the census of Israel. And there's some stuff in here that is interesting that we're not going to get into too much as far as like why he takes it. But anyway, even Joab in this whole thing recognizes this is not a good thing to do. David tells him to do it, and Joab's like, ooh, I don't think so. This is not right before God that we do this. And but they do it anyway, and they get the census is 800,000 men, fighting men in Israel, and another 500,000 men in Judah, right? Huge army. And after that, verse 10 says, David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. Before David got up the next morning, the word of the Lord had come to Gad, the prophet, David's seer. Go and tell David, this is what the Lord says. I'm giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you. So Gad went to David and said to him, shall there come on you 3 years of famine in your land, or 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you, or 3 days of plague in your land? Now then, think it over and decide how I should answer the one who sent me. David said to Gad, I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into human hands. So the Lord sent a plague on Israel from the morning until the end of the time designated, and 70,000 people from Dan to Beersheba died. When the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord relented concerning the disaster and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, enough, withdraw your hand. The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of, the guy that Jebusite, can't pronounce his name. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I have sinned. I, the shepherd, have done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall on me and my family. So, David takes a census and is given 3 choices, right? You get 3 years of famine. Now, I try to think if this was me given this choice, if I was the one that messed up. 3 years of famine is kind of not an option for me. That's a long time, 3 years of suffering. The other 2, 3 months and 3 days, are a lot more maybe acute as far as the punishment goes, but they're a lot shorter, right? 3 years, that would have been a long time. I don't think I would have picked that one. And then you have 2 choices after that one. You have 3 months of running from your enemies and 3 days of plague. And the next one, 3 months of running from your enemy, I think this one would have been the more tempting from David. Again, just trying to put myself in his shoes in this situation. And in the context of what he did, right? So he takes a census of his fighting men, 1.3 million people in all of Israel. That's a huge army, especially for back then, right? The Persians, you think of the Persians even years later who had a massive empire, and they go attack the Greeks, and they had 1 million men, and that was supposed to be like the largest one of the largest armies ever fielded. And even if David isn't capable of fielding all of his guys at once, like that's still a massive army to do kind of whatever you want. You've got a good commander, you've got a good track record, and yeah, God says you're going to be running from your enemies for 3 months. I kind of think David has to take God at his word a little bit, but isn't there something maybe in the back of David's mind here that says, yeah, but I'm a good fighter and I've got a huge army. Maybe I can do something to mitigate that, right? Make it a little less than what I think it could be. But David immediately chooses to put himself in God's hands, right? And I think his reason in verse 14 is the key to all this. What's he say? Not only takes God at his word that these punishments are going to be carried out, but doesn't trust in himself in this point. Doesn't trust himself to get him out of the situation or make it lessen the punishment, and he simply throws himself at God's mercy, knowing and trusting in God that God is a good God, right? You see this also a theme of David, just knowing who God is, having a deep understanding of who God is, and trusting that Israel will be better off in God's hands rather than running from your enemies in human hands as far as the punishment goes. I've been talking a lot. Does anyone have any comments so far? 2 weeks in a row now. You guys got to start throwing something at me. Yeah, that's a good question. Her question was, why is God inflicting the people and not David? So at the beginning of chapter 24, it says, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. I don't know if that had something to do with it, if God, I don't know if looking for a reason to punish Israel was the right term on this one. There's some stuff at the beginning of 24 that we're not going to get into. It's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about this morning. And I just don't understand it, to be frank. But it's an interesting topic if you want to dive into it on your own, for sure. All right. So we had this incident with him counting the census, or taking a census of the fighting men. I think it demonstrates, even at the end of his life, after all this negative stuff that David has gone through, that he still, he hasn't forgotten who God is, right? His faith is still strong. He still trusts in God to do the right thing. Yeah, God's angry with his people. Yeah, God disciplines us. Even today, he disciplined the Israelites apparently, and David in this situation. And but even in all this, David knows God. He knows he's merciful, and he knows he loves his people. You see also at the very end of his life, David still is demonstrating a high level of trust in God. And we'll turn there to 1 Kings chapter 2. And we'll read the first 4 verses. So this is at the very end of David's life. Solomon has been made king, the official heir to the throne. David is about to die. He's a very old man at this point. And this is his last words, his charge to Solomon. So we'll read 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. I'm about to go the way of all the earth, he said. Be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him, and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you go. And at the time and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. So, when you, in court testimony, taking a little step back here, in court testimony, when you're going to go testify in court before a judge, are you allowed to say hearsay, right? You guys heard of that rule? No. Hearsay, saying what, Brian, if you were to tell me something and then I go to testify and they say, well, how do you know about this? Well, Brian told me. I can't testify about that because I didn't see it, I wasn't there. That's Brian's testimony, right? It's not admissible. However, there's a few exceptions to that. One of them is dying proclamations, right? If Brian's on his deathbed and he tells me something, I can now say that in court because courts have determined that dying proclamation is inherently honest. It's someone's last chance to get something off their chest. There's no fear of repercussion because you're going to die anyway. And they're generally considered to be trustworthy and honest, and therefore admissible even under hearsay. And I bring that up in this case because this is David's dying words, right? Kind of someone's last words are generally considered the most important thing to them. And this is what David considers to be the most important thing to pass on to Solomon, right? And this is his last, Solomon's about to take the throne as a young man. Solomon was not the oldest child. In fact, he was one of the youngest. And young man, and David chooses to impress this on him. It's not battle strategies. David spent a whole bunch of his life fighting, right? That's why he wasn't allowed to build a temple. And you think, oh, maybe David wants to pass on a few tricks of the trade in that area to Solomon. It's not how to be a good king, or, management, any wisdom in that, anything like that. It is rather that God is faithful and he keeps his promises. David brings up two of them here. Promise of, that God makes to everybody. If you follow my law, if you obey me, you will be prosperous, I will bless you, right? That's a promise to everybody in the old law. And this is a verifiable one. David can look back through the history of Israel and see, yep, when we as a people were following God, we were blessed. I have been blessed in my kingdom. The kingdom at this time is prosperous. It's pretty prominent in the area. And David can look and say, yep, God kept his promise on this one. However, the second promise is a promise that God made to David personally, right? If you follow me, you will never cease to have a descendant on the throne of Israel. And this promise is not verifiable at this point. David is the first in his household to be king because of, God getting rid of Saul. So David realizes that God can very much switch thrones in Israel, right? And he hasn't lived long enough, obviously, to know that God's promise of a descendant of David being on the throne forever is true. But he takes it in the same breath as this verifiable promise that God made to all of Israel. And I think that says a lot to David, because I think he holds them to the same standard. The first promise is true, therefore the second promise must be true as well. And this is what he wants to impress on Solomon. This is what he wants to leave his son with. The most important thing to him, trusting in God, that God will get you through life. Do you have any comments or anything before we move on? You talking about David's? Okay. Mm. Okay. Yep. Yep. Mhm. Yeah. I was not. I was not planning on it. Mm. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It's very true. Hand up over here. Yeah, and like Lon said, there's we still serve the same God, for sure, and He still likes to bless us and still needs to discipline us for sure. Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely, that's a very comforting thing about David's life, right? Well, if he can do that, and God forgives him so willingly, he can certainly forgive me as well. Yeah, absolutely. We're gonna go turn to Psalms real quick. So this is an aspect of David we all probably know. He was a prolific psalm writer. There's 150 psalms, as we have recorded in the Bible, and David wrote about 73 of them, so almost exactly half. One of the themes that is in almost all of the psalms that he wrote was trusting in God, right? Lord is my deliverer, he's my salvation, stuff like that. Phrases that he uses in a lot of his psalms. And it just amplifies this theme of David trusting in God. So I don't think any study of David would be complete without Psalm 23. So we're going to go there and read through this. It's pretty short. It's only 6 verses. And I think it's so popular, not only because it's beautiful in how it's written, but also it sums up a lot of what how David viewed God, as far as trusting in him and kind of his relationship and how he viewed God. So Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I don't know when in David's life he wrote this psalm. I'd be very interested if we found out someday. If he was early on in his life when he was still a shepherd, or if it was later on in his life when he's kind of reflecting back and remembering when he was a shepherd and seeing God as that in his life. But the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. I think this is probably one of the greatest opening lines to a psalm, right? David was a shepherd. We see that at the beginning of his life, out watching over his father's sheep, and shepherds kind of have to get their hands dirty sometimes, right? David said he killed both the lion and the bear when it comes after the flock. And we see this analogy used with Jesus all the time, right? I am the good shepherd, the sheep hear my voice and they follow me. I think that hit home so much with David, that even though he was king of Israel, he still viewed God as his shepherd. He was the one that was protecting him. It wasn't this huge army or this, his mighty men around him. It was God that was his shepherd. And David says, with God as my shepherd, I don't lack anything. There's nothing that I need other than that, other than God in my life. And with God as my shepherd, it's not, he's just going to lead me to wherever, and whatever happens, happens. It says he leads me to green pastures and quiet waters. This idea of, as God, if I follow God, if I trust in God that he will take care of me, there will be peace in my life. It's kind of an idea of green pastures, quiet waters. I remember growing up when we were in Great Falls, my sister Brenna and I had to drive down to Helena to take the SATs, and we were driving down through the canyon in the springtime. It was April-ish, and I remember driving down, and it's kind of opened up in one spot, and there was just green hills. Normally those hills, those kind of foothills, mountains, are not so green, but it had just rained for a few days, and we're driving in there, and it kind of opened up into this valley, and the hills around it were green, and the river's going through it, and I was just like, wow, this is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And every time I read this psalm, that's what I think of. Just this protected valley that's green. You can lie down, be safe from enemies, and it's just this valley of peace almost. And I think David, even though, like Brian mentioned, that he was a warrior, and God said, you're not going to build my house, build my temple, even though David wanted to, because you have had too much blood on your hands. You've done too much fighting in your life. I still think that David, he obviously valued peace, and he saw that true peace comes from God. And the line, he refreshes my soul and guides me along right paths for his name's sake. There was some times in David's life that his soul definitely needed refreshing, right? After Bathsheba, even when Saul's chasing him, how weary would you be in that situation, running for your life for possibly years? And yet David can look to God in all those situations and realizes that his strength comes from God, right? God is the one that restores, refreshes your soul. And the line, the darkest valley, or the shadow of the valley of death, kind of whatever your translation says, I definitely think, we recite that line a lot, but I don't know, I don't want to take it away from our experiences, but I think David probably has a leg up on us in knowing firsthand what that means to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Just, again, running from Saul, having to go hide among the Philistines and pretend he's nuts so they won't kill him, that's a pretty terrifying thing. And if David can say that, I walk through the darkest valleys and I'm not afraid, I fear no evil, that is a pretty powerful statement coming from David. And the rod and the staff, they comfort me. The shepherd's staff is kind of an interesting tool, right? Kind of the staff, pretty long, got that crook at the end. It's used for a lot of different things. One of the things is herding and prodding, getting the sheep to go where you want them to, give them a little kind of nudge there. And that hook at the end, if a sheep gets into a pit or something, or you can kind of hook it and drag it out. And so it's a rescuing tool as well. And I think David realizes that God's kind of the same way with us, right? He has to discipline us. He has to get us going in the right direction at times, but also he's very capable in wanting to rescue us if we get in trouble. And David certainly saw that a lot in his life, as far as discipline, but also God rescuing him and watching over him as well. And then you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Kind of the idea that you can sit down and have a meal and not worry, even though there's enemies all around you. I've never seen a war movie where they just break out a meal right in the middle of battle and sit down, right? If you did that, your buddies would look at you like you're nuts. What are you doing? Get behind cover, shoot back, whatever it is. But David gives this image of there's enemies all around him. Everywhere he goes, there's enemies, and yet God is with him, and he is at such peace because of his trust in God that he can sit down and have a meal. That's such a powerful image to me. And then because of all of this, surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. David knows that in all of these dark times in his life, all the stuff that he went through, all the stuff that he's going to go through, because of his trust in God, because of his relationship with God, regardless of what happens, God's goodness and mercy will be with him all the days of his life. And as we look back on David's life and his trust in God, and even though he messed up and he's still considered a man after God's own heart, I hope that we can value trusting in God as much as David did, and really learn that lesson from him. Does anyone have any final comments? Absolutely. All right. Well, if there's no more comments, we'll say a prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father God, before you right now, we thank you for this time to study your word and a great character of faith in this last quarter. Father, I pray that we would be like David and be people after your heart, people that trust you with everything that we have and realize that regardless of what we go through, regardless of what we do, mistakes, triumphs, everything, it comes from you, and it is you that we need to trust. Father, you get us through life, through ups and downs and everything in between. And I pray that we would give glory to you, give credit to you, and trust in you with everything that we have, that you are a good God, you are a merciful God. And I pray that you would strengthen our relationship with you and with each other. Father, we pray all these things in your mighty name. Amen.